You are listening to That Hoarder Overcome Compulsive Hoarding. Learn about hoarding disorder from me, somebody who has it. I promote a better understanding of hoarding disorder, a stigmatised mental health condition that is mocked rather than treated with compassion. I want to change that, and by talking openly and honestly about hoarding, I hope to start conversations that help. Find out how to support the podcast at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/support. Finally, I am not a doctor. I'm just a hoarder doing her best. So do seek professional support if and when you need it. Hey, how are you? I am doing all right. I made a conscious decision not to open this episode with a complaint about the weather, because I've done that a few times recently and I hate being such a cliche.
Let's start with some housekeeping.
So, first of all, I have been a guest on another podcast this week. And that's always exciting and a bit scary, but this one was extra so because it's a podcast I've listened to for a really long time. So matching up the voice that I'm so used to hearing with a face was interesting. But Anna Sale of Death, Sex and Money interviewed me in a really sensitive and respectful way, which I really appreciated. And it is slightly terrifying to have my voice go out to an audience as big as theirs. But I am also quite proud of having been able to be open and answer all the questions really authentically and genuinely. And I think it was an interesting conversation. So I will link to that episode of Death, Sex and Money in the show notes at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. And I'll be really interested to hear what you think.
My guest this week is a self-described hoarder. This is different than being messy. She has so much stuff around her. It affects her social life, how she sees herself, how much she feels like she can share with others. And she makes a podcast about it called That Hoarder, Overcome Compulsive Hoarding. She's been making the show for years, more than 160 episodes since 2021. I first heard about it in Podcast the Newsletter. And once we started listening, we totally fell in love with the host. She's funny, honest, self-aware, caring, and she's also anonymous. It is too shameful to disclose how she hoards things. Her podcast listeners know about her habits, and very few others. So for this conversation, we decided to use a pseudonym. She's in the UK, so we settled on Elizabeth, like the late Queen.
Sometimes it feels almost like a kind of cocoon, like you're safe in the stuff. And I think for me, it feels quite physically protective and also a sense of I'm not going to run out. I'm not going to be without something I need.
This is Death, Sex, and Money. The show from Slate about the things we think about a lot and need to talk about more. I'm Anna Sale.
Other items of housekeeping are that we have more dehoarding accountability Zoom sessions coming up. So if you want to find out the dates for those and grab your ticket, you can do that at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/ticket. And I have also made a start on the October Dehoarding Darlings monthly update. So if you want to support the podcast and also get a little bit extra from me, you can do that at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/darling. So sometimes in life there are things we want but choose not to have. I can want to have a Kit Kat for lunch, but then still cook myself something with some actual vegetables instead. I can want to go back to sleep when my alarm goes off in the morning, but in fact, I get up for work. And I've been thinking, we manage all of these things in our lives that we want and don't or can't have. But that when it's a thing, a belonging, we seem to have kind of internalized this idea that if we want it, that's a reason to keep it, without really questioning that any further. But we can want to keep something or want to acquire something and let it go or not acquire it anyway. We're not children. We can want things, we can acknowledge that want and get rid of them or not buy them regardless of that want. And we'll survive it. And if that sounds like something you agree with, or if that sounds like something that makes you feel very anxious at the idea, listen on, because I both agree with it and feel anxious about it. So I'm going to talk through some of what that thing is about, why we can, in some areas of our life, want things and not have them because we're adults and that's how life is, but how that switches when it's a possession or when it's an item we want to acquire. Because hoarding disorder can distort the way we perceive things. If somebody suggests getting rid of something we own, we can instantly come up with 12 reasons to keep it, 14 potential uses for it, and 8 reasons we'd struggle without it. And it is part of this weird illness to see a use or a want or an appeal in many, many things. And when you add to this that fear of loss or scarcity that for many of us really overtakes us and is overwhelming and makes us cling on to things even more tightly, our brains can translate that as wanting it. As people who hoard, our emotional attachments to objects basically can be overwhelming. And it's important in the midst of all those strong feelings and strong reactions to remember that the nature of hoarding disorder means that we might feel we want or need something, but that feeling might not always be entirely rational. Hoarding disorder can affect our decision making, basically, and the irrational beliefs and fears can drive hoarding behaviours. And I feel a bit weird just dismissing these beliefs and fears as irrational, because it's not that simple. There are many, many reasons we have those beliefs and fears, and in some way, somewhere in our brain, it's entirely rational. It's entirely rational to have that many tea towels. It's entirely rational to have that many notebooks. But we can get caught up in that little bit of our brain where that makes sense and fail to see the bigger picture where, in fact, it might not stand up to that much scrutiny. We can also, as people who hoard, have difficulties prioritizing, working out what's actually important and what's not, and setting boundaries. And if you couple that with the overwhelming feelings of guilt and shame, and the fact that a lot of us have histories of trauma and grief, it's all very overwhelming. And if that manifests in us really, really wanting every single pen in the pot, there's some logic there, but it's not healthy or helpful logic. And this idea of wanting something but not having it regardless of wanting it, I think applies in 2 main ways. One is items we already own. Given the amount, the quantity of stuff in a hoarded home, we might like and want more of it than we can actually safely and comfortably house. So when we like and want things, we can't let that equal, therefore we have to keep it. That can't be a deciding factor, basically, because if we want more things than we can safely live with, it's more important to have a safe, usable home. So this applies to things we already own, but it also applies to things we want to acquire. If I see something in the shop and I want it, that's not good enough reason to automatically purchase it. And we know that on some level, I might want a mansion in the countryside. I don't, but if I did, I would want that, but I would know that I couldn't have it for 1,000 reasons, most of which are money. So we might want things we can't afford. We might want all kinds of things that we see on sale or that we see that somebody's left by the side of the road. Just wanting it or just liking it can't be permission to buy it or to take it. We might meet our friend's baby for the first time and fall in love and want it. We still leave it with our friend when we leave the house. There's all kinds of things we want that we don't acquire. And we need to be able to apply that when we're about to acquire things that are not friends' babies or mansions in the countryside, but are a cute t-shirt or a pair of shoes or a shelving unit. So we need to think of this in terms of things we already own and also things we want to acquire. And I'm also going to talk about feeling a responsibility for how we deal with our stuff based on what other people might want. So hold on for that bit. So a desire is a strong wish or longing for something. A need is something that's essential for survival or for well-being. And we do need to prioritize needs, first of all. If we neglect the things we need, that can have really negative consequences. Whereas focusing on and prioritizing the things we need, truly need, not like I need that new pair of Doc Martens because they're gorgeous, but more like I need there to be food in the fridge. And when we prioritize real needs, first of all, we get a more grounded and stable basis. But then we've got desires, and I'm not saying we must ignore every desire or like or want. That's not how life works. We're allowed treats, we're allowed things we like and want. The difficulty is when we have so many of them that we can't move around our homes easily, or when we have so many of them that we can't afford anything because we've spent so much money on them. And the thing about desires is that they are nearly always temporary. I can think of a handful of things that I really, really wanted when I was 25 that I still really, really want now. Actually, I think a handful is an exaggeration, a couple. And then I can think of a handful of things I really, really wanted 5 years ago that I really, really want now. Our preferences change over time. Partly that's because we grow, we change as people, we learn things. It's partly things that influence us, whether that's fashions, whether that's associations, like I associate that colour with that person. But our desires and likes and wants change, and that is a good and normal and human thing. And it's also a good thing to remind ourselves of when we feel like the thing we want right now is essential for our happiness for the rest of our life, or is essential for our security for the rest of our life. We might feel like we'll want the thing forever, but we won't. And that's how life is. Whereas if we acquire the thing, we'll probably keep it for a really long time, and it will take up too much space in our home, even if it's a tiny thing, because we already have very full homes. We already have more than we can deal with, more than is safe, more than is secure, more than is necessary for sure. This podcast started as an outlet for myself, but 200,000 downloads later, it's somehow become much more than that to a lot of people. I hear from people that me talking about my experiences and interviewing specialists and experts is helping them too. Hearing those stories makes the time and cost absolutely worth it. But if you want to help to ensure that the future of the podcast is sustainable, you can donate to help with costs. To send a one-off or recurring donation, just go to overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/donate. Thank you. And as well as these kind of medium-term and long-term patterns in how our desires change, there's also that novelty thing, that effect that novelty has on us that makes us really want something because it's new, because it's different. It feels more exciting than the familiar one. This shampoo smells different to my last shampoo. I'm going to buy it. And that can be particularly tricky if you're somebody who struggles with impulse purchases. That novelty effect when you're in the supermarket, when you're in the clothes shop. But again, like understanding that our desires change over time and reassuring ourselves with that knowledge that this need we feel right now will dissipate. In the same way, when you can recognize that it's not that the new shampoo smells incredible, it's the novelty effect. This is that thing where I feel like it's more interesting and exciting just because it's different. But in fact, what it will be by this evening is another bottle of shampoo that I will use 3 times before I buy the next bottle of novel shampoo. Desires mostly pass. And I really mean mostly. The thing you wanted to be when you were a child probably changed week by week and may well not be what you do now for a living. But even as an adult, those things change. My aesthetic when I was 17 is very different to my aesthetic now. I'm 47. The books I read were different then to now. The music I listen to, I do listen to a fair bit of 90s music still, but I also like other kinds of music as well now that didn't even exist when I was a teenager and that I probably wouldn't have liked much if it had. Trends come and go and come back and go again. And that does influence most of us in terms of what we want. We might not like to think we're that influenced by trends, but to some degree, most of us are susceptible in one way or another. And some of those desires pass quickly. You know, like if you're doing your supermarket shop when you're starving hungry and you come home and you realise that you have mostly multi-packs of crisps or mostly Mars bars. And then you go, oh, but what am I actually going to eat for my meals? That was a very temporary, fleeting desire. In the supermarket, because you were already hungry, you succumbed. Now, there's nothing wrong with crisps or Mars bars. I'm a fan of both. But I'm also a fan of tomatoes and pasta and spinach. So there's those very, very fleeting cravings. And then there are bigger ones. There's the album we listened to on repeat for an entire summer. There's the jeans we wore and loved for 3 years. So they all have different pathways and different kind of size life cycles. But eventually, our want for things changes, whether it's within an hour or within a decade. But because we are people who hoard, we get this strange kind of additional attachment to stuff. We might feel we need to own certain things because it defines us. We can see our things as part of our identity. We might feel the need to own certain things because they provide comfort or security. But the more we give in to this sense of, I must keep it because I want it, I must keep it because I want it, the more we drown because we can't move around quite literally. It might feel like a safe cocoon. It might feel like you're making up for years of neglect or years of poverty by having everything on hand that you could ever need. But if you take a step back and look at what it really is, it's not a safe or healthy way to live. And we do fear this sense of regret so much. I can't get rid of it because I'll regret it, or I can't get rid of it because I might regret it. But if I do, that feeling of regret is so unbearable that I can't cope. That's a real fear. That's real. But our fear of it is disproportionate. First of all, in my experience, there's the odd thing I've felt a tinge of regret for getting rid of. The odd thing. Out of hundreds or thousands of things I've got rid of. There's the odd one I feel a bit, about. Secondly, when Jasmine Slay was a guest on the podcast, one of the things we talked about was that in her experience as a professional organiser, people fear that they're going to regret getting rid of things. But what they don't take into account is that any regret they may feel is dwarfed by the joy they feel when they clear things out and make space and rediscover the things that are actually meaningful to them, that are currently buried in their hoard. And thirdly, if we do feel regret, we can cope with that. It might feel unpleasant, it might feel unsettling, it might feel uncomfortable, but we can do unpleasant and uncomfortable and unsettling. Living in a hoard is unpleasant and uncomfortable and unsettling. So the idea of not being able to cope with the potential risk of feeling regret, I'm not saying we overblow that fear because that sounds dismissive, and it's a real fear and it's big and it's limiting and it's frightening. But the alternative is to never get rid of anything in case we regret it, and instead live in a different kind of discomfort. It's not either risk feeling regret or live in perfect bliss. They're not your two options. The options are risk feeling regret or risk living in an unwieldy, overly full, unsafe home for the rest of your life. So when we are overwhelmed by, but I really want this thing, putting it in that context of your entire home, like, sure, you want this thing, but in the context of hoarded chaos, do you want it enough to justify it adding to your hoarded chaos? Regret is normal. Regret is human. Regret is unpleasant. But we can do unpleasant. You don't get this far in life without dealing with unpleasant feelings. And it's not inevitable. Regretting every single thing you fear you might regret will not happen. You might regret the odd thing. Most of it will go and you'll either feel better or feel neutral. Living in chaos for the sake of a thing you liked in 1997 isn't reasonable. And we might justify it by saying, but it's just one thing. I like it. I want it. It's just one thing. But clutter is made up of lots of just one things. But we can also get caught up on keeping something because someone else might want it, or getting rid of something in a really perfect, ideal way so that someone who might want it can have it. So that can look like I'm keeping this because my children might want it when I die. Or that can look like I'm not going to throw this away because someone might really want it and I should give it to a charity shop, or I should sell it on eBay. Both of those can be a delaying tactic. First of all, I don't like to admit it, but it's true. We can say that as an excuse to not get rid of it. But also, in a situation like this, we need to give ourselves a break. We can't take on the potential desires of someone who might visit a particular charity shop or someone who might be browsing eBay. Sure, someone might want it. They might. But it's not our responsibility to provide them with it. Often, our children don't want all of this stuff, any of it even. And if it's about getting rid of something in the perfect way and getting caught up on how to do it perfectly in case someone wants it means we actually never get rid of it because it's too complicated and we're being too perfectionist about it, I want you to know that you can throw things away or get rid of them imperfectly, even if somebody else would want it. It's not on you to provide everybody else with the things they might want. That's not your responsibility. You've got a life to live, and you can't keep wading through piles and piles and piles and piles because you can't get rid of a thing in the perfect way, or you can't get rid of a thing because when your child becomes an adult, they may buy a home, in which case they may need a kitchen table. Just because somebody else might want it doesn't mean we have to facilitate that. We are not responsible for fulfilling everyone's desires, and our own well-being and safety and the well-being and safety of anyone we live with has to be a priority. We need to set boundaries over what other people might want. And letting go of things or not acquiring things, that's not always easy. We can feel sad, we can feel guilty, we can feel a sense of loss. We can feel like we're putting our future selves at risk if we haven't got any sellotape because we threw away 3 scraggly things of sellotape that would probably never work anyway because they're 20 years old. We can feel like we're letting people down if we get rid of something they gave us. And it's okay if those are things you feel. Those are things that anyone listening to this podcast can relate to. We can feel sad at letting something go. We can feel nostalgic about things that we need to let go of. But we can let go of the thing anyway. I think it's good to acknowledge when we do feel those things and validate those things. Kind of say, I do like this and I do want it, but I have too many things, so I'm going to let it go. And that feels a bit scary. It feels quite sad. It feels a little bit risky. I understand why I feel those things, and it's okay to feel those things, but it's also time for this item to leave my home. I think being really mindful and noticing how we're feeling can be really valuable. I think talking to people, saying to someone, I'm scared of how I'll feel if I let this go. That's good. That's healthy. And reminding ourselves that even if this feels scary and unknown and unpleasant, reminding yourself of the things you love and enjoy and making sure you're doing some of those as well. Recognizing when we have those thoughts and feelings that can broadly be described as irrational. I explained earlier why I'm not fully comfortable with that word. But recognizing when we have those thoughts and feelings, sitting with how it feels, maybe challenging some of it, noticing what happens, seeking support and getting rid of it anyway, or not bringing it home anyway, is a really valuable learning experience and is something that can really make a difference to our homes. And when you do it, and if it's especially hard, have a little celebration. Don't buy anything. Use the nice perfume that you've been inexplicably saving. Use the nice china. Give yourself a little fist in the air celebration. it's actually quite liberating as well as frightening to realise that we can get rid of things even if we want them. It's quite freeing. You're not tied down and constrained by how much you want or desire something. You can feel that want or desire and then move forward in a healthier way regardless of feeling it. I'd love to hear what you think of any or all of that. Do drop me a line on social media or info@overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk by email.
It's the bit where that hoarder shouts out someone wise.
So shout out to a podcast called BBC Seriously, which I will link to in the show notes. In this episode, Professor Ian Robertson is talking about how anxious procrastination can look on the surface like laziness. Have a listen.
Ian told me about a few different takes on sloth, which outwardly look like the same thing,
i.e. someone not doing very much,
but on the inside are very different things.
First up, anxious sloth.
There's something that can appear like sloth, which is actually disguised anxiety. Maybe lying in bed in the morning or sitting around kind of restless, not doing things, not getting stuff done. And actually what's at root there is anxiety. There have been studies done across the world that chronically anxious people do less of everything because anxiety affects the avoidance systems of the brain. It's about pulling back from threat. And people who are chronically anxious see threat everywhere. And therefore they pull back, they cancel that appointment in the evening, they don't go for that interview. These poor people are not slothful, they're tortured by chronic anxiety. And that's what to the outside observer is sloth. But internally, it's far from sloth. It's a restlessness, a kind of tortured restlessness.
It's this kind of anxious sloth that often results in a kind of analysis paralysis, where you ultimately get less done in your day because you overthink everything and as a result struggle to come to any decisions.
Sometimes people who are indecisive, that indecision can lead to anxiety itself. So anxiety can lead to indecision, but also indecision can lead to anxiety because you don't get things done, because you're always second-guessing yourself. You haven't learned what essentially is a set of cognitive habits about making decisions in the full awareness that no decision is ever 100% certain. The future is always uncertainty, and you have to price in uncertainty into your decisions and live with them and learn to love them.
Now, I don't know about you, but I found that super relatable. Okay, thank you for listening, and I will speak to you next time. Thank you for listening to That Hoarder Overcome Compulsive Hoarding podcast. It's been a pleasure to have you on board. You can find all the links I've mentioned and a transcript of the episode online at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. To find out more about how you can support this podcast and the overall project, go to overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/support and do subscribe to the podcast so you make sure you don't miss any future episodes. There may be links in this podcast that earn me money. This doesn't come at any extra cost to you if you make a purchase through those links, and it helps to support the podcast.